said, you know what, everybody wants to leave, and here, take it, because you would avoid thousands of people. Because they're gonna take it. It's inevitable. Look at them now. Why did you think human beings changed? Not gonna happen.
Is Jesse okay?
Right.
Okay, just so that I get one.
Yeah, I agree with you. But here's the reality. Yeah, right. I mean, the truth is, and again, it doesn't matter because this is where we are. If any other halfway normal person was in president, this wouldn't have happened.
How would they start? How would they start?
It wouldn't start.
How are you?
They cut the pipeline. We gave
Missed you
what-
last
we
night.
gave what-
I sent you an email when I went to Fairmount Temple, wasn't I? He had a shout out for his birthday. I didn't just say no. I
Turn off our
You should have turned up theirs. You actually felt emboldened at
I
that.
made a comment.
So we're just waiting for the chance to do
How would they start?
Stop what? They needed the consent of this country and some of their allies.
Oh, that's a familiar face. How you been?
That was nothing to do with when Biden said, that's fine. Well, be that as it may.
It's okay, I'll get the right toast before I came. I figure I don't follow many of the, this, I figure, that's why I don't have to follow.
It really doesn't matter why.
Oh, really?
Morning, how are you? Happy cats over? All of that? So weekly, we was hard life. Perfect health. Cereal. No, not just a little exciting, so I don't like it. To overcome everything that happened. Yeah, the 2 weeks.
I don't.
My house is my favorite.
Doesn't mean anything
I
when
said,
you've
do
got
you
a
mind if I?
What are you gonna stop with?
So,
And then my daughter, entire family. Pardon?
Thank you again.
Oh, I want to talk to you about that. Okay.
When they saw it coming, why did the Ukrainian?
Your sister moved from Scotland.
Are you an early
Absolutely no option.
but not an early
It was the allies of what we want to call Russia.
It's always good.
So she has everybody was staying with her. David was so
And this country wanted it.
should there be tests in the protocol? And I was exposed to them because I think we are. He made me test.
It was an excuse.
Yeah. He's on the phone with the disease people at the
Education. I can't do it, for example. If I remember, we never really felt any love on it. Had a great staff. Was well paid and loyal. No matter where I went in the world, they would get a phone call at 10 o'clock. And sometimes I'd be on the phone for an hour and a half. Or hang up and do something and then talk. So, away from it. Mentally.
Yeah. Start knitting, right?
Well, 5 years I was with the group of friends. We made a living. It's like a great cure for partnership. You start out as friends and then you go on fist fights. And then my
Yes,
son
exactly.
Did you have the kids come in? We had only a we don't have, and it's true, because we really,
Good morning. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you. Just listening to which you gave me some years ago. It's one of the amazing pieces. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I mean, Schumann's a main man here. And Dexter Liebe. Yeah. Okay, very good.
It was proposed by another composer.
What's that now? Those things.
It was set by
That's something. Good morning, good morning. Shabbat shalom to everybody. I think we still have matzah over there, even though according to the Reformed tradition, Pesach is over. But they told me last night bagels were the something like that. We'll do one more day of matzah. It's not the biggest deal in the world. Although we get tired of it, don't we?
Are we going to do a blessing for the study of Torah? or are we going to do Take Me Out to the Ball Game, the original Aramaic?
Two very important prayers. Yeah. All right, well, I got this little note here somebody wrote. Tell us about pitching for the Guardians. Well, as I was saying on the way in, several years ago when the Indians were going through one pitcher after another, I asked my brother, he also was a baseball pitcher, I said, how far down the list can I be? I said, I've got to be in the top 500 in Northeastern Ohio. You know what he said to me? You're in the top 50,000. That stung. But, it was a lot of fun the other day. One thing I noticed when I got out to the mound and turned around and looked at home plate, I thought to myself, I missed when they moved the mound back 15 feet. I mean, I spent my childhood up until I was about 25 throwing pitches from a baseball rubber, a baseball mound. It never seemed long to me at that point. But it has gotten a lot longer. What's that a sign of? But I did say when the guy from the Indians who was going to catch the pitch came out, and I said to him, when you catch the pitch, I would like you to take your glove off and go like this. And he did. Although what I threw was not hard to catch. Kathy and I, several years ago, it's a long story that leads up to this moment, but we befriended a guy who ran a baseball program for youth in Parkersburg, West Virginia, of all places. And so Kathy and I, and Suzanne Utley, who some of you know, also came down with it. We went down there one day. I threw out the first pitch. It was a high school game, and Kathy sang the national anthem. That was a big thrill. But the guy who ran the program had the teams line up on third and first base when I was throwing the first pitch. And before I did it, I asked the catcher to come out. And I said the same thing to him. I said, when you catch the ball, take your glove off and shake, as if it was stinging. And you know what he said to me? Really? And I said to him, whatever you want to do is fine. I think he may have done it, actually. That was a lot of years ago when I could make it there on a fly. But it was a thrill to be on the field, and several people, including Cindy. You know my assistant, Cindy Wilson. Cindy is the one who started it all because she has a very close friend in the office down at the stadium, the Guardian's office. So Cindy began to set it up. Mike Chernoff, who is the general manager, is a member of our congregation. And evidently when Kim, who was Cindy's friend down there, heard about this, she must have talked to Mike, and Mike said, make it happen. So it took a lot of people to do it. I mean, it's not easy to get that down there on the field, but it's a lot of fun, nice memory, and so much support and friendship, which was great. I've been asked to say a word or two. I'm sorry?
How many innings did you throw?
You mean in actuality or in my head?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Does it matter?
There you go. Exactly. Our imaginations create reality. Yep. So I've been asked to just pause for a moment about what's going on in the Ukraine. And so let's just pause for a couple of minutes and think about all of these catastrophic deaths that are taking place over there in this really very senseless war. I mean, to use an adjective about a war is to suggest that there are sensible wars. And I suppose there are wars of defense, self-defense, but this one seems to make no sense, and so many people are dying, and the tragedy continues. So let's just pause and think about all of our fellow human beings who have suffered and died, and hope and pray that the hostilities will end. Okay, let's continue with the blessing for study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments, enjoining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Okay, so I want to welcome also those of you who are live streaming. I know there are several of you there, and I appreciate that you are. And also from time to time, you write a note to me about one thing or another. So that makes me quite happy to know that you're out there. What I want to do this morning now is, I'm sorry?
Time out.
We have to sing happy birthday.
We have a special little party for a special little group for a very special leader.
Oh, gosh.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday to you.
Happy birthday, dear Roger.
Happy birthday to you.
And many more.
May you all be strong.
Thank you. This is a birthday that never ends.
You and the queen.
I'm sorry?
You and the queen.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Okay, more? How many candles? 80 candles?
Well, that's, Jim got the candles, very special candles.
Look, it says 80.
So let's see what you have over there. Oh, I guess close them out.
Oh, look at it.
How great is that? Now what's the significance?
This is for you, for your reward.
Very good.
For good luck.
So glad someone's taking a picture.
Exactly. There should be enough, you can help yourself.
Nope.
We have a photo op.
Good job.
If you guys want to come over and get a piece of cake
No,
now,
but we need a
pause for
photo op. We
second.
need a picture.
That's later.
Later.
Can we get a picture of you over here?
This is Torah Study, isn't it?
Okay, everybody else.
Jim, the cake tastes better than the mom.
It's a sponge cake.
Anything.
So it's couple of hours. It's still possible.
It never hurts us.
Oh, that's all right.
Hey, set us up here. That's very special. Thank you so much. Yeah. Yeah, you know, I've been having a couple of conversations with Rabbi Klein, and he said to me he is proposing to the board that they extend my contract another 40 years, which would put me at 120. And he said he's going to make sure that it is renewable. Last night he said at the service, may you have as many more years as you've already had. That puts me at 160. I don't know. If we're still doing Torah study at 160, don't step on my respirator. It's a lot of fun. I appreciate it all. So today I want to make a turn to another topic, the topic of hope. which is the third of our 4 topics for the year. You know, we're working on Immanuel Kant's 4 basic questions. What can I know? What should I do? For what can I hope? And what does it mean to be human? And this is the third of the 4 for us. We looked at the beginning of the year at what does it mean according to the Bible to be a human being. And then we've spent several weeks on ethics, what ought I to do. And now we want to turn to our third of 4 topics for what can I hope. What has struck me really in especially the section on ethics, and now as I'm preparing for hope, is that I've known this all along, but it has really struck home in a new way for me. Now, the Bible is not at all a systematic book. It doesn't deal with topics as topics. It deals with them primarily, but not exclusively, as it is unfolding its narrative. And things come up, of course. And then there are sections of law, sections on ritual. So there are sections which deal with particular ideas, but ethics is never thematized as such. We have to make inferences from a variety of passages. And one crucial question in this kind of thing is, what counts as being included in the topic and what does not? So, for example, there's a famous essay by Aharon Lichtenstein. Is there an ethic independent of law in Judaism? When you think about God's commandments, God's revelation, it is primarily in terms of law. Are there ethical principles outside law, outside even what the Bible elaborates on? And he wants to make the claim that yes, there is. So he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 6 that what we should do is perform the right and the good. So those are general categories, which then allow us, with biblical warrant, to think expansively about the right and the good is. The word right has to do with obligation, the good has to do with value. Those are the 2 general topics in ethics. What should I do and what counts as a value? So that even the Bible recognizes that it's not entirely clear what belongs in the category of ethics. I think the same thing applies to hope. We can range around the text and come up with passages we think count as pursuing the issue of hope in the Bible, but it's not clear. I mean, when Aristotle writes his treatise on metaphysics, it's quite clear what counts as the content of that for Aristotle. It's enclosed within the 2 covers of the treatise, or ethics, or rhetoric, or poetics. The Bible is not an Aristotelian treatise, which not only talks about the issue, but tells us what counts as the content. And when you're dealing with the Bible and you want to deal with a topic, it's not entirely clear what the contents are. Does dealing with biblical hope have to have the word hope in it in order to count? Or can we make an inference from one episode or another? So it's the question of not only the content, but the form. One lovely definition of blank verse, now thinking about poetry, is that blank verse is creating the basket while you're putting the fruit in it. There's no pre-formed basket into which you put the fruit, so that the fruit also contributes to what the basket looks like. If you've got a cantaloupe and you want to put it in the basket, but the basket is too small for the cantaloupe, you have to recreate the basket. So I think topics like this are like that. We're creating the subject matter as we look through a variety of contents in the text. So what I'd like to do this morning, and maybe on into next week, depending on how far we get, is to try to create a sense of what the topic is. What are the general outlines? What are the general concepts and categories? What are the general passages in the text that give us a head start into trying to figure out what the Bible says about hope? So we're going to look at, through my reading, several passages, excerpts from essays that deal with this concept. So this is a kind of introduction to that whole question. The first passage is from this book, which now, after long use, is only half a book. I have the other half, but it's not connected with this. But a very interesting book, Contemporary Jewish Religious Thought. And it deals with all kinds of topics. It's not an old book, but well, it's 1972, so it's already 50 years old. But if you're looking for one book, and you can see that half the book is 500 pages, so it's 1,000 pages long. But if you're looking for just random ecumenism or covenant, conservative Judaism, commandments, catastrophe, heresy, Hasidism, loving kindness. It's just filled in alphabetical order with brief essays on wonderful topics. The authors are Arthur A. Cohen and Paul Mendes-Flohr. Mendes-Flohr is a hyphenated last name, M-E-N-D-S-F-L-O-H-R. Arthur Cohen, Paul Mendes-Flohr, Contemporary Jewish Religious Thought. And I want to read the first couple of pages in this book on the subject of hope. And the author here is Charles Vernoff. Okay. And of course, you can interrupt me with comments or questions as we go along. Hope as a Judaic spiritual attitude has its basis in the covenant relationship between God and Israel. Okay? Israel here stands for the Jewish people, okay? And not the land per se, not the nation per se, not Jacob, although yes, Jacob's descendants, because one of Jacob's names was Israel, as you know. And that's the origin of calling the Jewish people Israel. Hope as a Judaic spiritual attitude has its basis in the covenant relation between God and Israel. The covenant originates as a reciprocal bond between God and Abraham, directed toward a shared goal of producing a people dedicated to divine service. That's a great statement, isn't it? So what Vernoff is already telling us is we're not going to be in a position to understand the biblical idea of hope until we consider another idea, covenant. And what kind of a relationship is it? What are its benefits? What are its vulnerabilities? Okay? So already this introduces us to the difficulty of defining or describing biblical hope. We didn't know that we have to introduce other categories to get to it. I'm going to read that sentence again, the one I just read. The covenant originates in a reciprocal bond between God and Abraham, directed toward the shared goal of producing a people dedicated to divine service. And I take a divine service can be both vertical and horizontal. It can deal with our relationship with God, let's say through worship, and it can be horizontal, our relationship to one another. Because God in the Bible calls us to our relationship with each other. And so when we follow the commandments, we're not only serving one another, we're also serving God, who calls us to do this. What binds this original covenant of co-responsibility for the future is the faithful performance of actions. Let me start that again. What binds this original covenant of co-responsibility for the future is the faithful performance of actions. God's faithful leading, Abraham's faithful following. From such demonstrated mutual faithfulness grows the human disposition of simple and open trust. The Hebrew word emunah, which is often translated faith, but trust is also possible. Martin Buber talks about two kinds of faith in and faith that. Faith that is what I might call propositional faith. Faith that God created the universe. Faith that God gave the Torah on mountain. Faith that God will restore the people to the land. Faith in certain sentences to which we acknowledge that we believe that those things are the case. Faith in is trust. I have faith in God. I have faith in my friends. What does it mean that I have faith in my friends? That I acknowledge certain propositions, that my friends can do this, my friends can do that? No. It's trust in the overall relationship, okay? So the word emunah, faith, can have two moments, faith that and faith in. Martin Buber has a book which has the title Two Types of Faith. And he uses the word trust to acknowledge it. What binds this original covenant of co-responsibility for the future is the faithful performance of actions. God's faithful leading, Abraham's faithful following. From such demonstrated mutual faithfulness grows the human disposition of simple and open trust in God that seals the covenant bond. God calls Abraham. Abraham says yes. That seals the bond. The primordial condition, the original condition of the covenant was bound to be disrupted, however, by virtue of the fundamental inequality of its two parties. God's transcendent knowledge would at some point require divine action beyond the comprehension of human wisdom. In other words, God has and knows something that we don't and can't know. So already the relationship, which we described as God calling and Abraham responding, which now seems to be a relationship of equality, we now problematize it in a way that it really is a relationship grounded in inequality. God knows something that we don't. And in knowing it, he could command us in ways we can't understand. The binding of Isaac, for example, which we know is a really very problematic story. But in a way, it's a story that has to be told in order that we acknowledge that God is not just another pal. And we can step aside with God and say, well, what did you mean by this? Because God's knowledge and action transcends our comprehension. God's knowledge would at some point require divine action beyond the comprehension of human wisdom. Such action would necessarily jeopardize covenant mutuality in seeming to violate the perceived faithfulness of divine responses in human situations. We can't really fully understand God's part in this covenant, although God has committed himself to that covenant. Human infidelities would eventually also threaten trust. right? So we start with a mutual relationship, and then we see that each party contributes to its inequality, God's transcendence and our perfidy, our infelicities. Human infidelities would eventually also threaten trust. Confronted with cognitive limitation by transcendence, we can't know, first marked by the binding of Isaac, direct covenant trust accordingly had to extend itself toward deeper underpinnings in the reciprocal spiritual dispositions of faith and hope. Only in relation to faith, therefore, may hope be understood. Okay? Hope in God, hope in ourselves, hope in the future, God's control, or at least interest, power over the future. In order to understand and bring into being the idea of hope, we have to recognize both the covenant and the covenant's problems. Reciprocity between God and human beings constitutes a core principle of covenant itself. The fundamental biblical and Judaic notion that humanity is a partner with God in responsibility for completing creation. Okay? So the very notion of covenant, think about the notion of relationship. In a true relationship, each party has responsibility and therefore power. Okay? And in the covenant relationship between God and Israel, though it's unequal, each party has to have power and therefore responsibility for the relationship and what the relationship implies. That's the idea of biblical covenant. Humanly initiated actions are indispensable contributions along with divine initiatives to redeeming the world. We're called to perfect the world. Who is responsible for this process, this ambition? Both human beings and God. God doesn't create the world and create automatons to serve God. This is an ancient Near Eastern idea, that human beings were created by the gods in order to serve the gods. The gods eat, the gods need food in ancient religions, many of them, and they're tired of finding food for themselves, so they create human beings in order to serve them. In this sense, human beings have only narrow responsibility and therefore power to serve the gods. In a covenantal relationship where human beings are made in partnership with God in order to improve the world, both have power and responsibility for that aspiration. See how hope comes into the picture here? For whom, to whom can we repose trust and hope for the future? And the answer is already God and human beings. Not one or the other, but both. If it were one or the other, we'd either have secularism, human beings on our own, or we'd have a kind of absolute power of God, and we just wait for God. But here in the covenant relationship of mutuality, both are responsible for the work of hope. Humans must therefore maintain their own active intentionality toward redemption alongside of and coordinated with the divine intent. I love the pair of terms there. Alongside of, that is, God works independently, as do we, and coordinated, working together in one way or another. From this autonomous covenantal dignity of human beings within Judaism, right? That's a powerful idea, isn't it? the autonomous covenantal dignity of human beings. Our dignity, in a certain way, originates in God calling us to partnership. And God's calling us into partnership, according to the Bible, gives us our dignity. From this autonomous covenantal dignity of human beings within Judaism derive the coefficient attitudes of faith and hope. I guess I'm willing to go along with that phrase, faith and hope, although I don't think he distinguishes them well enough. In a certain way, faith and hope for this author seem to be synonyms. Each, faith and hope, he is saying, is an expectant volition toward, this is a little complicated, each is an expectant volition toward a cognitively obscure future. Cognitively obscure. We can't understand it. We can't predict it. But we have hope in a better future, the unfolding of which we cannot comprehend in advance. But whereas faith indirectly affirms God's intention, hope directly exercises human intentionality. Okay, so that's his distinction between faith and hope. Faith is faith in God. God will do his part. Hope is hope for human beings. I like the duality of God's role and human beings' role, but I'm not sure I like the way he said it. Faith is the conviction rooted in primal trust that God remains actively intent upon bringing the redemption or some seeming good despite any appearances to the contrary. So hope, in terms of God, is that God somehow will come into the picture and help the situation toward improvement along. That's faith in God's role. And the Bible, as you can see from what we know about the Bible, continues to believe that God will in some way come in and do something, whether on a small scale or a large scale. The Exodus from Egypt. Jeremiah, changing human nature. That's one of Jeremiah's big hopes, that God will somehow at some point transform human nature so that we'll automatically do the right thing and not possibly do the wrong thing. Because, this is my way of putting it, the biblical author has become a bit depressed as he writes the story of history, which is a circle of human depravity, going in the wrong direction, and then God calling him back. We had the exile. God is going to call us back. And there's going to be another need for exile in the future, and God will call us back. How about just curing the thing right away? Let's just change human nature so that we don't sin anymore. And therefore, there's no reason for punishment, let alone exile. That's Jeremiah's great hope. Who's going to do that? You and I aren't going to do it. So if anybody's going to... So that's another example of God's continuing to come in and try to alter the corrosive course of things. Faith is the conviction rooted in primal trust. I like that word, primal. In other words, before we even think about it, we have this trust, if we do. The trust precedes skepticism. Maybe skepticism without some primal trust is not going to lead to trust. Faith is the conviction rooted in primal trust that God remains actively intent upon bringing the redemption or some redeeming good, despite any appearance to the contrary. Oh yeah, really? I don't believe that. Despite any appearances to the contrary, things seem to be cyclical. Is there really improvement in human history? If I just examine the facts of the matter, it doesn't look like that sort of thing can happen. But faith here, hope for this kind of thing, is one of the pillars of biblical faith. And we have to explore the content. Where does it emerge? And thus, this embodies an indirect will toward a future goal. We recognize, the biblical understanding of God recognizes that there's always hope for some kind of redemption, capital R or small r. Hope, he's making this distinction on the other hand, is a self-concerned, direct, and often specific will toward a redeeming good engendered by humans out of their pressing concrete needs. That's the other side of this. Human beings are called upon by the Bible. This isn't just theoretical. This isn't just somebody's idea. This is a reading of what the Bible has to say about this question. That there's also in the Bible a recognition that human beings can move the redemptive process along. The two complement each other. Faith holds fast to its conviction, regardless of how irrational circumstances become, and no matter how difficult it is to imagine their divine integration. Faith holds fast to hope. Hope deepens in urgency through rational assessment of the extent of an immediate human problem. Hope is under pressure as the situation gets worse, such as the suffering arising from the Babylonian conquest and exile. That was a huge crisis in the history of biblical unfolding. And could we still maintain hope that somehow that dire situation was going to be turned around? Faith awaits some unanticipatable divine initiative toward long-range solutions of mundane problems. Hope may expressly anticipate some divinely granted opportunity that human initiative might seize to help provide contributions to this objective. Notice the trust that human beings have a role, but as he puts it, the divinely granted opportunity that human beings, in other words, made in the image of God, or that God grants us free will, so that though we can work to this in this process, the Bible's conviction is we're not just secular human beings. By our very nature, we are connected to God. And what we have in terms of the endowment, free will, reason, is a gift. And not something that is just a natural occurrence. Thus, faith asserts, I'm confident God will eventually deliver us, according to his unknowable plan. That's a biblical idea. Hope, see, for him, faith is about God, hope is about human beings. Seems a little arbitrary to me, but I like the dualism. I think the dualism is right. Faith asserts, I'm confident God will eventually deliver us according to his unknowable plan. Hope, he uses a big word here, contrapuntally. Counterpoint is a musical idea, right? Where two themes are working together, okay? So, hope contrapuntally declares, I fervently wish God might deliver us soon, possibly through means of our own acts, under the circumstances which call us to action. Okay? Now, that's a little bit dense as I'm reading it, but you can see how wonderful it really is in setting up something of the structure of hope. Okay? Two different ways we can repose confidence in two different instruments. The Bible does both. We need to see exactly how. Gary, you had a comment.
Well, I just wanted to make a point about free will, which you just mentioned. I think the covenant itself is built on the structure of free will.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And if you go from A, A is the covenant, B is hope, and C, it's all built on concept of free will.
Right.
The initiative of humans.
I'm sorry?
And the initiative of humans.
Right.
The problem is, as we were just talking about a few minutes ago, the problem is the human will, or lack of at times, and the fact that human nature just doesn't seem to change. So I would say that in response to your comment about Jeremiah, it was hopeless for him.
Although he manages to find hope, nevertheless, doesn't he? With a very extreme solution. Yeah, Jeremiah, who lived and wrote during the end of the First Temple period, and actually himself went into exile, though not to Babylonia, he went in exile to Egypt. Once the Tanakh says he goes to Egypt, we never hear about him again. We just don't know what happened to him. And so he loses hope. But what's very interesting is that the urge to hopefulness, let me put it that way, that even though the situation on the ground, empirically, in terms of the facts, don't yield any hope, there seems to be in the biblical consciousness a reluctance to give it up entirely. And so the biblical author, let's say Jeremiah, comes up with something amazing, really. I mean, God created the world. He split the Red Sea, made the sun stand still. He gave manna in the wilderness. He can change human nature. That seems to be the only out for Jeremiah. And yet I'm Jeremiah. And I'm suffering now, and I'm seeing my people suffer, and parades of people going to Babylonia. And I believe in God, and I'm God's servant, and I have no idea how to get out of this. So I have a choice. Shall I just succumb to despondency? Or shall I try to find some glimmer of hope? Despondency would have been very easy. The facts on the ground, you read the front page of the New York Times every single day, you tend toward the despondent. What's fascinating to me is Jeremiah could not imagine leaving it there. He's going to have to come up with something. And he comes up with something amazing. I mean, the improbability of the content of his hope points to the desperateness of the situation, doesn't it? Changing human nature. What flashes through my mind at this moment, there's a famous theorem. What is Fermat's last theorem? Anybody know what Fermat's last theorem is? There is an equation in algebra, x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n. So if it's 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, n is the 2, and you have x, y, and z, yes, 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, right? 9 plus 16 equals 25. And Fermat said, I have a proof that this is true only with the coefficient, the n of 2. He wrote this in the margin of one of his books. I have a proof. Well, scholars have tried to prove this from that moment and have not been able to come up with it, which makes them doubt whether Fermat had a proof. But there was a guy at Princeton, his name was Wiles. What was his first name? Something Wiles. He came up with a proof. It took him 7 years to find it, working in his attic. He publishes it. Another mathematician finds a problem in the proof. So Wiles goes back to work and patches up, corrects the problem after another long period of proving it. And lo and behold, everybody believes that he proved Fermat's last theorem, which makes it possible that Fermat had a proof. Although Wiles was dependent upon certain mathematical discoveries that weren't available in Fermat's day. I think the Takayama hypothesis, something like that. So here's why I bring this up. Why does Wiles do this? Because he wants to prove it. Why does he continue to do it after 2 years of failure? Because he wants to prove it. 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. And then somebody finds a flaw. What does Jeremiah do if he's Wiles? He's close to giving up. He believes in God. Well, Wiles doesn't give up. He has hope that there is a way, even though the facts on the ground point to the impossibility. I mean, here's a major mathematician at Princeton, and he's working for 7 and then 2, I don't know how many more years. So there is this idea that certain people with certain assumptions will not give up hope even if it requires some stretch of the imagination or credulity to do it. That's why I bring it up. Jim?
But we're all faced with this stuff 24/7, I think, even though it's, maybe simple. I mean, we all have faith that the sun's going to come up tomorrow, whether you realize it or not. And you all hope that, you all have faith that rain will come when we need it. But if there's a drought, you have hope that it'll rain pretty soon.
Right.
And then you have, God forbid, you have someone you care about that's really ill, and the doctors say there's nothing we can do.
Yes.
I don't think you sit back and take that. You say, I hope there's something we can do, or somebody can do something. And then when that escapes you, you start praying.
There you go. There you go.
And I think, I can't imagine anybody hasn't been in that spot at some point.
Yeah. I think that's an awfully good illustration of this, especially what you said near the end, that we count on the doctors, we count on science and the achievement, we count on human beings until it becomes more and more difficult to count on human capacity. And then we pray. I mean, that in a way is a biblical way of looking at it, right? That there is a hope that something that seems improbable will happen. I wanted to say something about this. What? I can't remember. Yeah, no, I think that's good. Oh, I know what I wanted to say. I'm going to introduce yet another concept here, because hope is about the future, about something that has not happened yet. And yet, Jim, what you're suggesting is that the past also contributes to hopefulness. Why do I believe that the sun will come up tomorrow? This is the problem of induction, right? I can have 100, 1,000 examples of the sun coming up, but that still doesn't lead to the utter impossibility of it's not coming up tomorrow. It's possible that it not come up. So no matter how many examples you get of something, you can't predict with certainty the next example will happen, right? The gap is never closed between the piling up of examples and certitude, right? But the fact that it has come up all those times gives us some foundation for believing that it'll come up tomorrow. The fact that medicine has cured so many diseases, or at least made life longer in the presence of disease, is evidence from the past that hope is plausible. So that hope now, we've introduced the notion of hope in God, hope in human beings, and you've illustrated it nicely in modern day, but it's certainly the biblical conviction. and also the relevance of what happened before to what we can hope for in the future. And when you think about the categories of the before and the after, let's add another category here, the present, the past, the present, the future, these are terms that define a story, right? Because the story is moving forward, but it moves forward in the light of what has happened in the past. And what has happened in the past can give hope for its recurrence in the future. The prophet Isaiah, who has hope that the Israelites will be brought back from the Babylonian exile, is grounded for him in the experience of the Exodus from Egypt. God redeemed us once, making more plausible the hope that God will redeem us again. And guess what? The first 11 books of the Bible tell a story. It's in story form, so that the very structure of biblical religion, or the very structure of the biblical pouring forth of its features, is done as a story. I might think, just to speculate, where does hope come into the picture here? I might say that the biblical author first had hope and then wrote the story. I might also think, which strikes me as more powerful, that in the telling of the story, the biblical author discovered hope. Discovered in what has happened in the past for good, and often in surprising ways, leads to the expectation of more good and more surprises. And I suppose the surprises can relate to what human beings are capable of doing but don't do every day, and what God can do. There is an argument here, indirect argument through narrative, for God, isn't there? I always say when I say this sort of thing, that the biblical author is involved in a big dare, trying to convince us in so many ways, for so many pages, that this way of looking at the world and our lives has deep power. I call it a dare because the biblical author is sophisticated enough to know that there are alternative ways of living good lives. Ecclesiastes might be a good example of it. You know, Ecclesiastes probably makes it into the Bible because of the very last verses of chapter 12 that somebody might have tacked on in order to make it a little more orthodox. But without that, Ecclesiastes, is deeply skeptical about a lot of things. So it's the introduction of skepticism into the arena of faith. Yeah, Candy.
Would you say the rise of Christianity is a result of the ineffectiveness of this argument, or of the idea of failure of hope,
Right.
in those books of the Bible as the argument is portrayed in stories?
So Candy has raised really a great question. Is the rise of Christianity attributable to, now this is reductionistic, so let's phrase it again. Is one of the factors that led to the rise of Christianity a sense of that this model has run aground? That the cycles have happened over and over and over again. We were in Egypt, then we were in Babylonia, the Assyrians got us, then the Persians got us, then the Greeks got us, then the Romans got us. I mean, really, just what's the plausibility of hope? I can live better tomorrow, but can my people live better for the next 500 years? Now, there is a category in Christian theology, I think the author is E.R. Dodds, realized eschatology. Eschatology is a doctrine of the future, how things will turn out. Think about it. The Bible has an eschatology in one way or the other, that God will change the human heart and things will be hunky-dory. Or that God will renew the covenant and never again will he send us into exile. Those are eschatological elements. The problem is, let me say it probably too excessively, it never happens. It's good. How does the Bible end, by the way? The Bible ends with a circle. The last 4 books, Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, end those 4 books in the same language as the beginning of those 4 books. So when the biblical editor is asking, well, what comes next? I mean, after all, this story, according to the biblical editor, continues after the Bible story is finished. But the biblical author creates a circle at the end, as if this is the paradigm, this is the pattern. If we're going to understand any moment in history, we don't have to keep doing empirical research. All we have to do is recognize that this is the basic pattern, and it repeats itself over and over again. One way of understanding Christianity, that it became frustrated with the non-realization of the big promises. Realized eschatology is, it's happened now. It's come to realization in the life and the death of Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah. So Christianity solves the problem that is posed by the Bible. That's that notion of realized eschatology. I'll just give you an example how even that idea runs aground. So you know St. Paul, who is probably more responsible for the rise and the content of Christianity than Jesus. Jesus is the subject, but Paul gives it its outlines and its content. What does Paul do? He goes from place to place and founds churches. So he goes to Ephesus and he founds a church. Then he moves on to Corinth. Having arrived in Corinth, he gets a word that the people in Ephesus are misunderstanding his preaching. So he writes a letter to the Ephesians, which now becomes a letter in the New Testament. This happens to be what scholars call pseudo-Paul, attributed to Paul, but probably not Paul, so it's not a great example in that sense. But Paul's letters are an attempt to I don't want to be reductionistic here as if they're all about just this. But one of the things that concerns Paul is misunderstanding. So one of the misunderstandings that he tries to correct, and you can understand this from the notion of realized eschatology. In other words, if the eschaton is here, if the end of days is here, what are my responsibilities? What do I need to do? Nothing. It's here. I can read the paper now from 7 to noon. Then I can watch the ball game. I can have a drink and watch TV at night. What are my responsibilities? So that if Jesus Christ, through his death, solved the problem of human fallibility, what happened in the Garden of Eden, the first Adam, Jesus is called the second Adam in Paul's letters. The first Adam brought death into the world through sin. The second Adam, Jesus, who took our sins upon him, conquered death. So Paul hears that what the Ephesians, now I don't think it's, maybe it's the Galatians, I can't remember which letter, drew that inference that we are no longer responsible for certain actions or certain ideals. And he writes back to them and he says, wait a minute, now you're wrong about that. We still have responsibility. And he opens up a gap between current time, which is not by definition end time, and end time, which is going to have something to do with how we act. We still have responsibilities. You misunderstood it. So, did Christianity solve the problem? Christianity, I make bold to say, wanted to, and had a view that this was the end of history, so to speak. But it turns out that its thinkers showed that no, there's still work to do. History goes on. It's not fully realized. So I think it's a wonderful idea. I mean, the two, I think, powerful points in what Candy is saying is there is frustration in our hope when it never gets to realization. So I lose hope. I had hope based upon my own past that when I stood on the mound last Sunday, that I could get the ball to home plate on a fly. I used to do it routinely, but it turns out I couldn't. So, I mean, we get frustrated when something we are aspiring to doesn't ever seem to come to pass. And it can lead to a kind of bolt into the future. The whole Shabtai Tzvi debacle in the 17th century, where Shabtai Tzvi said, let's all go to Jerusalem, sell our land, and we'll all move to Jerusalem, and once we get there, God will send the redemption. He had some problems along the way. He was threatened. He converted to to Islam. He converted to Islam. That's the end of the Sabbatean movement. When your leader converts to another religion, that's the definition of it's over. What's interesting was it wasn't over, because his interpreters who wanted to keep hope alive said, wait a minute. This is not a sin. This is just another way for redemption to be able to come about. After all, they hypothesized, if the redemption of the world means defeating sin, how can you defeat sin without entering into the domain of sin? You can't defeat sin from the outside. You have to get into sinning yourself and cleanse it from within. That's what the conversion to Islam meant. It meant a new move in the process of redemption. Sabbatean religion continues to thrive. I mean, it's one of the great moves in the history of religion, isn't it? To rescue victory out of the jaws of defeat. You could think of Christianity in this way too. When your Redeemer dies ignominiously on a cross, when Pontius Pilate asked the people, shall we save one of these people on the cross? And they say, save the criminal.
Dismas? Is it Dismas?
I don't know. And your Redeemer dies on the cross. That's the end of your project, isn't it? But no. I mean, this is what's spectacular about the imagination of historical religions who believe so firmly in the truth of what they believe that they can show us that what looks like defeat is really not defeat. Because when Jesus Christ dies, crucified, it's over. I mean, he lost. No. The crucifixion was exactly the way of defeating death, through his death, taking our sins on and suffering our punishment vicariously. And therefore, we are redeemed. That wasn't a defeat. That was a big victory. Thank you very much, Jesus. And so on. So these are great things. Let's go on a little bit. Let me read you something from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who I think you all know. The whole of Judaism is a set of laws and narratives designed to create in people, families, communities, and a nation habits that defeat despair. Now, I like that. I'm going to read it again. The whole of Judaism, this is a big statement, of course, is a set of laws and narratives designed to create in people, families, communities, and a nation habits that defeat despair. Judaism is the voice of hope in the conversation of mankind. Now, maybe a little overstated, as if other religions and peoples don't do it, but I certainly think he's right about the Judaism. Let me just continue and then we'll talk. To be a Jew is to be an agent of hope. Now, you see what's great about that, if you believe it, is that he's talking about what is the essence of being Jewish. He's just not talking about what some Jews do. He's making a normative claim that this is what Judaism and Jews are. It's a big claim. To be a Jew is to be an agent of hope in a world serially threatened by despair. To be a Jew is to be an agent of hope in a world serially threatened by despair. Every ritual, every mitzvah, every syllable of the Jewish story is a protest against escapism, a protest against resignation, or the blind acceptance of fate. Judaism is a sustained struggle against the world Judaism is a sustained struggle against the world that is, in the name of a world that could be, should be, but is not yet. That's a powerful statement of hope, isn't it? Bill?
Does that whole concept leave out the sense of, I can't best phrase it, redemption or the Messiah actually appearing? Because it's that cyclical argument of despair and, shall we say, faith and hope out of despair. I don't know. I'm trying to tie it to your answer to Candy's argument or statement and his statement in this whole conflict. I mean, the thought is that faith and hope seem to be aspects that maybe all human beings have in their relationship to any form of supernatural or force greater than themselves.
If they believe in that force. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm trying to figure out where redemption and the sense of the lack of a Messiah actually appearing. I mean, is somebody like Sacks basically saying the Messiah, the coming of a Messiah in the Jewish religion is a myth. It is just something that we just anticipate and hope for, but perhaps, like with Jeremiah's conversation, we know will never happen.
It's a good question. You know, the notion that the idea of the Messiah, or let me broaden it, see if you accept this attempt at an equivalence.
I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. What's the myth? The myth, as you put it, is the coming of the Messiah as a hypothesis. The broader way of saying it is the myth is the fact, the hope of the inbreaking into historical human reality, the transcendent. That somehow there is a God who will do something, one example of which is sending the Messiah, but not the only example. He could change human nature. He could just bring us back from exile. In other words, the notion of the Messiah might be problematic, but if you think of it as just one expression of the faith that God will break into history and do something decisive, now the question is that a myth? In other words, I broaden your claim about the myth to include the breaking into empirical history something from above. Right? Because when God redeemed us from Egypt, he didn't send a Messiah. So would you accept my broadening of your idea that might it be a myth that we hold on to of a double-decker universe? That there is up here something, there's God or something supernatural that can have an impact and change the course of it. Just like the engineers change the course of a river, God can change the course of history. Would you accept that broadening?
Not really.
Okay.
Because it once again avoids the question that, as you suppose, that perhaps Christianity attempted to answer for human beings, that this cycle of despair and faith and hope without meaningful success, without the spiritual success, will keep happening. So I'm only using the phrase Messiah as a counterpoint to maybe the word redemption, or however we want to phrase that sense of hope and faith.
And are you saying, could not this be a myth?
Well, I'm just saying that Judaism does not seem to state firmly that, I'm saying, how am I saying it? That the concept of the Messiah is the concept of the unreachable, is the concept of the non-event happening in reality. It's always just an intellectual hope.
An illusion, you're saying. An illusion.
Illusion, myth, however you want
Okay.
to phrase it, or intellectual gymnastics.
Right. So here's if I'm understanding your point, with the Enlightenment and the critique of religion and the attempt to eliminate the religions in the life of communities because they base themselves on dogma, on often intolerance, and on esotericism, in the sense that, how do I know that God sent you? Well, give me some proof. I can't, because it's just between me and God. And that esotericism is dangerous because fanatics can make all kinds of claims about being called by God. So that what the Enlightenment did, at least one important stream of the Enlightenment, is to try to bracket out religion in the life of the community towards secularization. Let's call it secularization. The word secular comes from the Latin that means this world. This world and not this world. Okay? Now the question is, with secularism and the elimination of religion from the public square, did the notion of Messiah and Messianism disappear? I might say yes, because that's part and parcel of the dangers of religion. The reality is, no, it did not disappear. Messianism found secular forms. The Enlightenment itself is a messianic movement, right? Look, did anybody in the 15th century wake up one morning and say, we're living in the Dark Ages? These are the Dark Ages? Whose notion was that? It was the Enlightenment's notion. They renamed the Middle Ages the Dark Ages in order to make a steep contrast between what the Middle Ages was up to, obscurantism, religion, superstition, and what we're up to. We're up to now the deployment of reason, which is a public mechanism. You can go into the laboratory and do an experiment, and I can go in and do it too and check your work. I can write a treatise where I say X, Y, and Z, and you can use your reason to read my treatise, which is in the public domain, and assess its value. So enlightenment is based upon the ideology that reason and science and tolerance can cure the millennial ills of society. That's a messianic movement. Reformed Judaism is a messianic movement without a Messiah. That we can eliminate all of the mysteries and the obscurities of biblical religion. What do I care if I can't eat this animal or that animal? It's not what goes into my mouth, it's what comes out of my mouth. And I can participate in the Enlightenment project of bringing peace to the world, right? Zionism is a messianic movement. Nationalism is a messianic movement in a certain way. There are two kinds of nationalism. There's jingoistic nationalism, my nation is better than yours, and there's a kind of liberal nationalism, that I have my nation, you have your nation, and you have your nation, and we're a concert of nations that work together. Liberal nationalism is a messianic movement. Obscure nationalism, jingoism, is the opposite. So what's interesting is, when the traditional notion of the Messiah or Messianism was eliminated, it still persisted. So my response is, Messianism is an imperishable element of the human condition. We're always going to imagine the cure. And we might imagine that we have the cure. So in a way, it might be a myth, but let's think about the definition of a myth. A derogatory definition is a false story. That's what a myth is, it's false. Plato's view of myth is that it's a likely story. Let's tell a story through which we want to get to the truth about the world. And the myth of the Messiah is one of those, I'm saying, likely stories whose energy persists to the present day. The League of Nations, the United Nations, that was a messianic move, wasn't it? That somehow we could get all the nations together. Unfortunately, the bad guys have a veto in the Security Council, so nothing can happen. Vivian?
Well, I am glad you brought up the word imagine, because that's been sort of in the back of my mind since the Sachs quote. The words that popped out to me were narrative and voice. And it strikes me that imagination is the power of faith. I mean, you talk about two realms, well, the only bridge we have is our imagination or our creativity to write the stories.
Yeah.
And the stories are not only instructive, they're redemptive. So that answers our need for redemption.
Yeah. Or at least it lays the groundwork for it.
Right. I mean, of course, you're not going to...
We tell the story and then we try to live it.
Right.
Yeah. There is an alternative to the imagination, and that's revelation. We build the stories in which we live, or God gives us the story in which we should live. The advantage of revelation, I might say, you're probably going to challenge this, is it's the only one. The Bible is the Bible, if that's what you believe. Revelation poses itself as the one normative story. The imagination, of course, is a fertile idea. Everybody has an imagination, There are many stories. By definition, the imagination creates many stories. So in terms of coherence, I mean, whose story am I supposed to take as my story? The Iliad? Pilgrim's Progress, right? Joyce's Ulysses, the Bible? There's a bunch of stories around. So the imagination is potent and creates story. I'm not opposed to it. But the problem with the imagination is you can't pin it down to one story. That takes, what does it take? I mean, if you believe in the one revelation, that's the solution. Look, when Ferdinand and Isabella exiled the Jews and also exiled the Muslims, what were they trying to do? I mean, it's hard to give them a break here, but what they were trying to do is to solidify the power of one story. You got the Jews in there with their story, you got the Muslims with their story. We're trying to create a nation state. That's an interesting question. What are the vehicles for creating a nation state, a unified community? I think there are three possibilities at least. One is God. The other is the story. The other is enemies. Enemies solidify a state. We gather together to fight a common enemy, right? Idea two is a story. But if there are many stories, you can't use any one of them to give coherence to your community, because there are many stories, right? So I think you're right about the imagination. You know, the Greeks, for example, did not have a scripture. They had many stories. The Iliad and the Odyssey, of course, were quite normative in ancient Greece. One of the reasons Plato was so opposed to poetry is he thought, and he was thinking of Homer, that the poets had an astounding capacity to create stirring images, but they don't know the truth. And therefore they can mislead you with stories. I mean, Achilles sulks in his tent. What kind of a model is Achilles for the Greeks? So Plato is opposed to poetry because the poets are dangerous. What's to replace it? Philosophy, right? Reason, which in principle can get us to the truth. And then you can illustrate the truth with a story, which is what Plato often does in his dialogues. Where the heck are we? Nada, help us.
Just ask you, please, to read the second line of Dr. Sachs's.
The second line again?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'm gonna read Judaism is the voice of hope. Is that the one?
Yes.
Judaism is the voice of hope in the conversation of mankind.
Thank you.
We're out of time, but what I wanted to do next, and we'll do it next week, is to look at excerpts of a very, very wonderful essay by David Hartman. I don't know whether anybody knows David Hartman, one of the great thinkers of our generation. And the name of the piece is Sinai and Exodus, Two Grounds for Hope in the Jewish Tradition. What Hartman does in this essay, with plenty of build-up, is that he looks at these two stories as paradigms for two kinds of hope. The Exodus gives us a certain kind of hope. Mount Sinai gives us another kind of hope. So what Hartman is doing here is what we've talked about, that the past, that the stories that we tell help to guide our thinking and expectations in the future. And so Exodus and Sinai are not just stories, they become ways of understanding certain things. Paradigms, models, exemplars, which in itself is a fascinating idea. What are the great paradigms in the Bible? One of them is the tabernacle in the wilderness, isn't it? One of them is the creation of the world, creation. Right? One of them is the Garden of Eden as a paradigm for the way in which felicity runs aground and defeats itself. These are all generalizations of parts of life, of our lives. So I want to spend some time on this essay. If I just downloaded this today from the Cleveland Public Library. You know, the Cleveland Public Library has everything. If you get a password, you can go on there. I went on there this morning. I looked at David Hartman. I knew I wanted to find this piece. Comes up. I download it on the computer. I print it. Everything is there. It's quite astounding. I'm doing some talks for the Cleveland Chamber Music Society in a couple of weeks on the Schubert cello quintet. You know it. I go into Cleveland Public Library, Schubert quintet. That's it. I got everything. I don't have to even get dressed. And I've got the whole world at my fingertips. It's astonishing what you can do. Okay, so next week we will take a look at Hartman, and then we're going to go to the Bible and look at some examples of the paradigms that we have explored: the human and the divine, the role of the past on the hope, and so on and so on. Good.
What year did David Hartman write that?
1978.
Yeah.
He created the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, which still flourishes. Hartman died several years ago, but he wrote a major book on Maimonides, where he tried to show that there are not two Maimonides but one. That's a question in Maimonides scholarship. Is there Maimonides the halachic Jew, and there's Maimonides the philosopher? Is Maimonides schizophrenic? After all, philosophy, one of the definitions of philosophy is to ask the final why. Why is this? Because. Why is the because? Because. To try to get the fundamental principles of life. And so philosophy features, Socratically, asking questions. The halakha, biblical law, gives us the answer, for which there are no more questions, right? 8 days of the holiday. Are you kidding me? What else could it be? Till the Reform movement came along and said, wait a minute, it doesn't have to be, so we could have cake today. So Hartman tries to show that those two Maimonides are one. That's a major question of Maimonides, and a fascinating one, isn't it? Can we have two different mindsets in one mind? There's something that is rock bottom, and I'm going to base my life on it. On the other hand, my rock bottom principle is to interrogate what you think is rock bottom until I get the final answer. This is why Socrates was so problematic for ancient Greece and for any society. He was accused of corrupting the youth. Oh, he meant for good. He didn't corrupt the youth. Yes, he did. He taught the children to ask questions. And once you get an answer, to ask a question about that answer until what? The foundations of society, the myths of society. George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and modeled integrity, right? Abraham Lincoln is kind of the Christ figure in American history, who sacrificed his life for, these are the myths of America. Interrogate them and you find out George Washington did not chop down the cherry tree. Abraham Lincoln was just a guy who happened to run into an assassin. That's irreverent, I know. But so the Socratic approach to life, even in the experts at asking questions, can be very corrosive to society. You know, the great, I'm going on and on here, Aristophanes, the comedic dramatist, wrote several comedies. One of them is called The Clouds. What are the clouds? The clouds are the clouds up in the sky And philosophers look at them and say, wow, that's a rabbit. Wow, that's a worldview. The philosophers just make up stuff and call it the truth, and if they're great rhetoricians and impressive people, we're likely to believe them. Whereas they haven't gotten to the truth. They've just given us an alternative truth to the truths that make society sound. Aristophanes is not wrong. It has always seemed to me. Anyway, Socrates is my hero, who also is a hero. All right, I'll see you next week. Shabbat Shalom.
So,
Let's move away so you don't
Shakespeare.
think laughs at us Is it all myth? I mean, based on historical sources? But when he puts together.
So, Flo and I are going to talk about having like 3 to 12, 5 minutes to 12.
So, if it's just his
Exciting some other day.
But I want to buy some new sneakers and stuff so we can.
People believe that Caesar was assassinated. Caesar was a good soldier, who was assassinated, and his last words were to brute.
Saw them at,
It's interesting. But we read it because aside from being factually correct, in terms of truth, he got to some of it. And therefore it's worth reading.
It's not factual. It's just one part of it's not factual.
Here's a claim I want to make to each of you. The truth is more important than facts. I mean, we all live in stories. What, you mean JFK? The movie, yeah. You mean the movie about the assassination? That's a good point. I mean, let's suppose that the facts are, was there a grassy knoll shot or not? Were the Cubans involved in those wars? True. But let's assume it's a great movie. Does it also announce truths that stimulate us, that cause us to
oh, good, I'm so glad you're taking.
the quality of it, from which we learn something at that story? Here.
Was under control again.
You know, you're making it because of society, if the coherence of society is rooted in the stories that we tell ourselves. One of the elements of modern incoherence is stories. And one of the values of the spectacular things about medieval society is there was only one story. That gives coherence, and of course maybe unconscious in society, but the story is imposed over and over again. Maybe you love that Judaism thing. I don't. And therefore, it grows something from our commonality in this narrow way. That's modern.
Hey, Roger, this will be quick, I promise, but I don't want to leave without acknowledging Wednesday and your very lovely interception on our discussion in the evening. You have a charming way of being provocative.
Oh, you agree with me?
Somehow humanity.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
right.
I was surprised at the reaction.
Well, it went on. It could have been just one comment, but it shows you it's not about skin color, it's about what's under our skin. Oh my God, we just, fall apart. One way, either we're gonna shut down or we're gonna take it.
You know, what struck me, and it's problematic to say it, but I will anyway. Tony
Yes.
looks to me like a wonderful person, and a very devoted person, and an important part of our discussion. And yet her presence inhibits a bit.
And I have actually had coffee with her.
Did you? Good for you.
Yes, yeah, no, we're bound to each other now for further conversation, so I know her only a little bit, but she is right there, and I think part of the problem of our group is that are we all Jewish? Is there anyone in the group besides Tony? First of all, if we're going to have a racial discussion, how can we all be sitting around as Jews in that discussion? I mean, how do we get anywhere?
We bring a uniformity to it.
Well, we're all sitting at the table, we still all have a different, we get each other riled up, but how is that? So I don't know where the group started, so it's not fair for me.
It was Patty
Yes,
who had the idea.
great idea. And how did she get the other people on board? Or who's been there besides Tony?
So she and I collaborated on putting the thing together. We publicized it. Irwin is involved in the racial justice task force, so he's always had a voice in this, and I think he's brought her in.
Because he has a relationship with her through, she is a student, and she's a very effective